Let me welcome you again to our MIDEM-Lecture series. Our guest this afternoon is Marta Lorimer, a postdoctoral scholar at the University of Exeter. This afternoon, she will speak about protecting the nation from migrants, decline, and other threats, radical right emergency politics, and their purposes. Marta, as I said, is a postdoc at the University of Exeter, where she works for the Horizon 2020 project, integrating diversity in the European Union. She also teaches at the London School of Economics and Political Science, where she recently defended her PhD. This January, Marta was a visiting fellow here with us in Dresden at MIDEM, which we were very happy about. Marta is an expert in the far right, in Euroscepticism, and in the study of differentiated European integration. Recently, her article, an excellent article called Europe as Ideological Resource, the case of the Rassemblement National, was published in the leading journal of European public policy. And today she will present another excellent paper, a working paper. Marta, the Zoom floor is yours. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Manès, for the introduction. I am going to start sharing my PowerPoint presentation. Well, first of all, thank you very much for having me here. It's a pleasure to be presenting, although of course I would have preferred to be in Dresden to do this. I was originally expected to present this paper in January while I was there, but then I eventually couldn't. So this is the first time I'm presenting it, and the paper is called Protecting the Nation from Migrants, Decline, and Other Threats, Radical Right Emergency Politics and Their Purposes. So the study of radical right politics is by now a very well-established field of research. While it was virtually non-existent in the 1980s, it has really grown exponentially in the last 3 decades, and it has addressed a series of questions such as the causes of far-right success, and the implications of their growing presence in democratic policies. Now, identifying the correct nomenclature for this party family and defining its main ideological characteristics has really been the subject of extensive debates. And while scholars still use a variety of terms such as populist radical right, extreme right, or far right to refer to a broadly similar group of parties, in recent years, what we've really seen is the convergence on the definition of these parties as primarily nationalist, or even more specifically, nativist parties. So nativism, as defined by Casmud, is an ideology that holds that states should be inhabited exclusively by members of the native group, so the nation, and that non-native groups and people are fundamentally threatening to the homogeneous member state, nation state. So there are 2 interesting things about this definition. First of all, it's very functional in terms of distinguishing the good and more inclusionary nationalism that we associate with a more civic tradition from the bad, negative, ethnic, or exclusionary nationalism that we associate with the far right. But for the purposes of this paper, what is really interesting about the definition of nativism is that it really brings attention to the central role that the notion of a threat occupies in far-right ideology. And Casmud is not the only one to notice this. Existing research has already highlighted the importance of notions of danger and crisis to the success of the far-right. So for example, Ruth Wodak in 2015 persuasively argued that a defining feature of far-right parties is that they construe minorities as a scapegoat and threat to the nation. And she calls this a politics of fear. In a similar vein, but focusing more broadly on the use of the concept of crisis by populist actors, which include but is not limited to radical right ones, Benjamin Moffat identifies continued references to crisis, breakdown, and threat as a key to populism. And what's interesting for both authors is that they all suggest that the creation of the crisis is not innocent, but it very much serves a specific purpose. So for Wodak, the use of a politics of fear serves to legitimize radical right policies through an appeal to the necessities of security. For Moffat, on the other hand, this continuous references to crisis, breakdown, and threat serves the key function of sustaining populist actors' success because it forges a representative link between the sovereign people and the populist leader. So the far right's reliance on these ideas really serves specific purposes, including their legitimation as political actors. And building on this literature and on works on emergency politics, what I argue and what I'm going to be arguing today is that the far right's and the radical right's reliance on a vocabulary and imagery of danger serves their political legitimation because it proposes a suspension of normal politics and encourages consideration of unconventional actors and solutions. So in the sense, when radical right parties use a vocabulary of emergency, they're promoting the idea that desperate times call for desperate measures, and which makes it possible for them to present themselves as providential actors holding commensurate solutions to the dangers being faced. So the way the presentation is going to proceed today is I'm going to start by giving you a little bit of background on why I claim that radical right parties suffer from a legitimacy deficit. Following this, I jump into the theoretical account of how emergency politics can serve the purpose of radical right legitimation. And then I will give a brief empirical illustration by drawing on speeches by Rassemblement National leaders, Jean-Marie Le Pen and Marine Le Pen. In the end, I will conclude thinking a little bit more about the implications of the argument and how it applies in times of an actual health emergency. So, first of all, why do I say that far-right parties, radical right parties, suffer from a legitimacy deficit? So, parties of the radical right, while growing their electoral basis, have also been mostly kept out of governmental positions, essentially because of two types of doubts. On one side, there's doubt concerning their credibility, so whether they have the qualities and experience to access power, and secondly, and more problematically, because of the acceptability of their ideas. So the key question is whether the measures that they would enact in power can be considered as legitimate and aligned with what would be considered good and proper within a democratic society. So in response to this state of affairs, radical right parties looking for legitimation have had different options available to them, and they actually have been trying to exploit them in many ways. So one first strategy that is available is to adapt and mainstream. So this consists of softening their ideological message as to appear more palatable. And because we're going to be talking about the Rassemblement National later, it makes sense to talk about them as well with this strategy, because the process of de-demonization that Marine Le Pen started when she arrived at the helm of the party is perhaps one of the most well-known instances of this, the softening of the ideological message. So when Marine Le Pen took over the party, she very much had the objective of making the Rassemblement National more coalitionable. And this demonization entailed a softening of their message, which in many ways helped it expand its voter base and create even a short-lived alliance with Debout la France in the presidential election of 2017. Now, a second option that is available to them if they don't really wish to mainstream or change too much is to actually stick to their position and potentially even radicalize them while trying to shift public perceptions about the acceptability of their measures and ideas. So in this case, instead of adapting to existing views of what counts as legitimate political actors, radical right parties work towards shaping ideas of what may be considered as acceptable behavior. So for example, they can claim that their measures are common sense, they're responsive to the will of the people, to the will of a sizable, silent minority. And in this process, they may actually be helped by the actions of other political actors, such as mainstream parties, who may pick up on their ideas and contribute to their mainstreaming. So it is in the context of the second strategy for legitimation that far-right parties may actually benefit from using their very own form of emergency politics. So emergency politics may be broadly defined as actions departing from conventional practice and rationalized as necessary responses to exceptional and urgent threats. So while this topic itself is not a particularly new one, faced with events such as 9/11, the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, detention centers in Guantanamo, and the responses to the economic and financial crises since 2007, scholars have increasingly turned to analyzing executive action in exceptional circumstances. So here, really prompted by the Schmittian interest in the state of exception, this growing body of literature has produced a number of insights into the practice of emergency politics, its moral and ethical justification, and its broader implication for national democracies and transnational institutions. So understandably, the main concern in the literature has really been with how executives deal with actual emergencies. However, I would argue that there's a case to be made for expanding the scope of analysis and looking at how the concept of an emergency may be mobilized by non-state actors, such as international organizations, but also citizen groups and political parties. So looking at this really refocuses our attention on how actors or citizens may use the notion of an emergency to justify or provide the background for their own exceptional actions and validate their choices in front of the public. So emergency politics in this sense no longer refers exclusively to state practices that violate the rule of law, but to a broader mode of politics, and essentially a rhetorical strategy that is founded on the interlocking of a provocative practice with a particular form of validation, which usually bears the vocabulary of emergency, exceptional, rescue, and so on and so forth. So in this expanded sense, emergency politics becomes a mode of validation that is available to far-right parties. So far-right parties or radical right parties, I apologize for sort of going always between the two, and by extension, the people promoting these ideas that are commonly understood as extreme become the provocative practice that needs to be validated, and the constant reference to threats becomes the mode of validation. And I argue that this process follows a two-step procedure. The first step is by constantly referring to a threat or an alleged emergency, parties alter social understanding of the situation around them, and they create the sense that conditions are so dire that normal rules no longer apply. So the threat or the emergency may take different forms. Migration is, of course, a traditional concern of the radical right, but this emergency may also be imputed to generalized insecurity, terrorism, complex processes such as globalization and European integration, which may not necessarily be ascribed to individual actors or others. And because when social groups feel that their survival is threatened, they become more prone to accepting emergency measures. The far-right's claim that there is a suspension of the normal state of politics really creates the space for others to consider things that would normally be considered unacceptable, such as their positions, as appropriate and commensurate responses to the danger that is being faced. So, in very short, the far-right's use of emergency politics essentially creates the sense that some kind of radical action is needed to protect the society that they are addressing. And once this emergency has been created, we go into the second step, which is when radical right can present themselves as the harbingers of the unprecedented action that is needed to respond to the emergency. So they become providential actors whose solutions can bring about change. So in this process, what is also interesting, of course, is that their limited experience with government is something that can actually help them, because they can play with the fact that they have not been empowered in the past and can claim that their calls for timely action have been ignored by those who were in power. So they really can present their policies as radical and new, and most importantly, commensurate to the type of danger that is being faced. So just to sort of briefly sum up, the main argument that I'm bringing forward is that radical right parties can exploit the nature of emergencies as occurrences which alter the definition of what counts as legitimate political action. They can do so to promote the idea that given the circumstances, their own extreme positions are a commensurate response to the dangers being faced, and that they are the best place to address existing emergencies. So what does this look like in practice? So I have here 3 different speeches from 2 Rassemblement National leaders. And the first speech that I have is a speech that was given by Jean-Marie Le Pen in 1992. So it's quite an old speech. And he gave the speech at a political rally in the city of Reims shortly before the referendum on the Maastricht Treaty. So the speech very much encapsulates the Rassemblement National's opposition to Maastricht. And for several years after it was pronounced, it remained a part of the party's anti-EU narrative, being frequently cited as a symbol of its long-standing opposition to the European project. So in the speech, Le Pen, it really starts with presenting a situation of very, very grave danger for France. So he's essentially saying that, the powerless and corrupt systems ask the people to give up their national sovereignty, thus destroying in time our identity, our language, our culture. It accepts the subordination of French laws to European laws. It opens our borders to foreign immigration. It initiates a process which it proclaims irreversible, a process that will ineluctably lead to the loss of our liberties, to the dissolution of the state, the eradication of our language, the disappearance of the French army, and finally the death of France. So that escalated very quickly, but it really gives you a sense of this overarching sense of emergency that he is really trying to create. And he very much follows this up with a proposal of a solution, in other words. So emergencies don't only create a problem. Emergencies don't identify the problem. They also suggest that someone needs to do something about it and needs to do it quickly. And this is when Le Pen moves in and presents pretty much himself and his party as the only people who are willing to do something about this crisis. So in the following passage, he essentially says that, as a party, we solemnly declare that we reject Maastricht. We swear to fight with all our strength until the 20th of September, and if the totalitarian methods of power did manage to mislead the people, to fight against the execution of the Maastricht plot. We swear to defend the liberties, the independence, the freedom of the French people, its culture, its language, its humanist and Christian civilization against the political genocide that it is the infamous Treaty of Maastricht. So Le Pen is essentially presenting himself and the Rassemblement National as a whole as the only actors willing to do whatever it takes to save France from political genocide. And I think what is rather interesting is that the party also essentially hints at the fact that they're willing to go against democracy and whatever the people vote in case they are misled. So they're really stressing that they're willing to go to great extents to challenge the emergency situation in which in which France finds itself. And while there's a lot of commentators who study the Front National will tell you, well, Jean-Marie Le Pen was something, but Marine Le Pen has quite changed the party. And while that is true to some extent, emergency politics is not only neither thematically linked only to the European Union, as in the previous speech, nor is it an exclusive feature of Jean-Marie Le Pen's discourse. So the second speech that I have is more recent. It centers on the theme of migration, and it was pronounced by Marine Le Pen in the Rassemblement National's Summer University of 2015 at the height of the EU migration crisis. So summer universities are an important yearly appointment for the party because they're a key training ground for young leaders. And they're also one of the first political appointments to take place after the summer. So they're also usually well reported. And in this case, Le Pen delivered a very long speech of about 1 hour, where she addressed various crises, including the migration crisis, and in a procedure that is very similar to the one used by her father in the Reims Oath. She starts by identifying a series of crises of various nature, and then uses this as a springboard to defend the Rassemblement National's political action by presenting it as a shield against them. So here she's basically talking about a conjunction of crises of various natures. So she talks about an economic crisis, a social crisis, a migratory crisis, which don't just follow each other, but they reaccumulate. And just after she identifies all these crises, one of the interesting things she says is that when I say these things, people often reply, "Come on, Ms. Le Pen, you're exaggerating." But that is not true. And why do I think this is important? Because The most interesting aspect of this excerpt, in fact, is really focused in the second part, where she's justifying the Rassemblement National as an answer to the situation of emergency. So the first way in which she does so is that is the one that I just briefly mentioned, is that she essentially claims to bring forward measures that, while commonly perceived as extreme, so you're exaggerating, Ms. Le Pen, are in fact necessary and commensurate to the danger that is being faced. So this is really explicitly stated in that statement when she says that people tell me I'm exaggerating, I'm really not. The second thing that she does is that she really stresses the fact that the measures that the party brings forward in terms of migration are not only necessary, but also the only responsible choice available. So at the beginning of the second excerpt, she really insisted, being a politician means that you cannot be governed by emotion. Politics is about responsibility. And today, truth calls for us to say that we must not welcome additional illegal migrants who need to be taken back to the country of origin. So essentially, she's presenting a rather extreme measure as one that is completely necessary and the only responsible thing to do. Finally, in the final part of this excerpt, she employs very much this politics of "we told you so" to essentially underline the prophetic nature of the Rassemblement National's analysis in their most well-known area of policy. And she presents the party as the compass of the French in these difficult moments. So what she's saying is that the current migration crisis does have an advantage. It highlights the rightness of our analyses. And then she goes on to conclude with, now more than ever on this topic, as on others, the Front National becomes the compass of the French. Here again, the metaphor is interesting. What she's suggesting is that the French don't really know what they're doing. They need a compass. And in this case, the Front National is the compass that knows what the necessary measures that need to be taken are. So in the final excerpt that I have really shows once again how the Front National or Rassemblement National tends to present itself as the only appropriate response or the only actor that has the response to the situation of an emergency. So this final speech is from the final excerpt is from a 2007 speech that Marine Le Pen gave in the Puy-de-Dôme department in 2017 in the context of her refoundation tour. So the idea of this refoundation tour was to go around local federations and explain to them why the party was changing its name and sort of rebranding. And the speech was addressed to both activists and journalists. And what I think is interesting about it is that at a time in which the party is allegedly changing, the notion of an emergency remains completely key to their narrative. So once again, in this part of the speech, she really presents several features that we've already seen before. So an emergency that is taking shape, and it's an unstoppable decline, it's chaos. So she's describing France as a country in free fall. The society is undermined by social fractures of various types. Paris is defined as a city that is dirty and infested with rats. It's a country where generalized instability creates a situation of insecurity, where the state is no longer doing its job. Neighborhoods are becoming favelas. So it's an extremely charged language. The dangers they do come from migration, but they don't only come from migration. And they are really, and she's starting to talk a little bit more about social issues which are meant to appeal to a broader public. So this is also part of Le Pen's attempts to speak not just to her traditional right-wing electorate, but also to branch out to former left-wing voters. So once again, she follows this up with saying that what we're looking at are the characteristics of the country transforming into a third world country. It is a slope on which our country is about to slip, an unstoppable slip that only we can stop. Never, my friend, has the Front National been so necessary. Never has it been more necessary for the national movement to be in power. So really, she stresses the continuity and the usage of emergency, even as the party was reforming. But also, once again, this idea that there is some necessary action that needs to be taken. It's not simply a question of picking between alternatives, but you really have absolutely no choice. So what's interesting here is that it's essentially a different form of Tina politics, just one that is brought forward by the radical right to suggest that they are the only people that actually have any kind of answer to the danger that we are currently facing. So to conclude, narratives of crisis and emergency are a familiar staple of the rhetoric of the radical right. They also, and this is what I've been trying to argue, they also serve specific purposes. And one of these purposes is really to legitimize the radical right's political action. So at this point, you might be left with some questions. Now, the first question, of course, is how is this any different from Ruth Vodek's Politics of Fear or from Benjamin Moffat's construction of crisis? And I would argue that compared with Moffat, what this account gives is that it really alerts to how parties may rely on the use of a politics of necessity rather than a politics of representation in the construction of these discourses. So in other words, this is a strategy that remains open even to non-populist actors because it doesn't really require the creation of a representative link, but just an argument that there is a state of affairs that is so dire that you need some kind of radical action to overcome it. In addition to Vodek, I think it really suggests that emergency and crises should be approached as processes which do not always involve a clear other, either in the shape of the migrant or in the shape of the elite or whatnot. The emergency can also be something that is quite wide. So, for example, European integration or globalization more broadly. And another thing that I think is quite different from Vodek is that what I really try to focus a lot more on are the processes of self-legitimation rather than the processes of othering that are central to her account. This being said, the argument that I bring forward is not, shouldn't really be understood as mutually exclusive, but it can actually work with the other two and they can reinforce each other. Now, the second thing you might be wondering about, of course, is whether this is just the Rassemblement National. So I've been studying the Rassemblement National for like 5 years now. So they're the party that I'm most familiar with, but I would also argue that this argument may be credibly applied to other political parties on the far right. So a fairly compelling example of a similar use of emergency politics was actually provided by Thierry Baudet of the Forum for Democracy, when in entering the parliament in 2019, he basically proclaimed that he stood in the midst of a civilization in ruins, citing uncontrolled migration, universities, journalists, political leaders, and the EU amongst the root causes of this decline. And he very much followed up the stage of identification of emergency with a presentation of his party as holding, and I cite, concrete solution to stop mass immigration and having the right people to restore control over our borders and unbundle the euro currency. So essentially, he very much used the concept of an emergency to validate his political party and present it as the only one who would know how to restore Dutch people's power in their own country. And another familiar example of this is Nigel Farage's infamous Breaking Point billboard, which is problematic on a whole series of levels. But what it really did was creating the sense of an emergency through the depiction of swarms of migrants to advocate for a radical break in the existing political order, which only the Leave campaign could deliver. And finally, of course, there are some obvious limitations to the argument that I brought forward. So I think the main one is that claiming that far-right parties can exploit the notion of an emergency to validate their political action does not automatically entail that they will be believed. So the argument that I developed here focuses only on one part of the equation. However, for the strategy to work, there needs to be a level of popular buy-in, which can be based either in the idea that there is indeed an emergency that needs an immediate answer, and on the perception that the far right does hold the answer to it. And I think this caveat may help us understand why far right parties may experience different levels of success when they exploit a narrative of crisis. So, for example, Marine Le Pen's calls in the middle of the migration crisis were a lot more likely to be heard than her father's during the ratification of the Maastricht Treaty. And while in 2015, Marine Le Pen's appeals to emergency were essentially supported by the use of emergency language in the media and in the political landscape, in 1992, her father's calls were not presented in an equally conducive environment. And in a similar fashion, if we're thinking about what's happening right now, one can assume that one reason why far-right parties have not been able to take equal advantage of a public health emergency such as COVID-19 is because they were not perceived as having the appropriate solutions. So while on the topic of migration, for example, they do have an established profile and a clear, albeit extreme, political agenda, they're not really adequately equipped to respond to an emergency of medical nature where technical expertise tends to be prioritized. So in some, while they pretty much own the former issue, they do have a lot less sway on the latter. So that is it for me. Thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to hearing your comments.